Christ alone my hope is found. He is my light, my strength, my song, this cornerstone, this solid ground, firm through the fiercest drought and storm. What heights of love, what depths of peace, when fears are stilled, when striving cease. My comforter, my all in all, here in the love of Christ I stand. In Christ alone, who took on flesh, fullness of God in helpless babe, this gift of love and righteousness, scorned by the ones he came to save, till on that cross as Jesus died, the wrath of God was satisfied, for every sin on him was laid. Here in the death of Christ I live. There in the ground his body lay, light of the world by darkness slain, then bursting forth in glorious day, up from the grave he rose again. And as he stands in victory, sin's curse has lost its grip on me. For I am his and he is mine, bought with the precious blood of Christ. No guilt in life, no fear in death. This is the power of Christ in me. From life's first cry to final breath, Jesus commands my destiny. No power of hell, no scheme of man can ever pluck me from his hand, till he returns or calls me home. Here in the power of Christ I'll stand.
We continue this evening in the lesson that we began last week, lesson 52. For those who want to follow along just in the Bible, it's in Luke chapter 12, verses 1 through 59. Last week we got down to verse 34, where Jesus had said, "For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." Sadly, in this present day, people's hearts are focused on earthly treasures. People are in pursuit of worldly things, and sadly, it causes them to lose out on something which is much greater. And so as he talks about the fact that God, it was his good pleasure to give to you the kingdom. And so with that, we spring on into the lesson tonight. Here we see that God intended to give the kingdom. I am disappointed, saddened sometimes when we see people say that God intended to set up the kingdom, but the Jews rejected him and he just gave us the church to make do until he could come back and set up the kingdom. And if it's God's will to do something, God is going to do that. When we think about the events and circumstances that are reflected in the scriptures, When it came time for God to take the Israelites out of Egypt, He took the Israelites out of Egypt. He intended to give them the promised land. He gave them the promised land. Of all the various promises and prophecies that was given to them, they all came true, whether it was to their benefit or ultimately to their captivity. All of those things came true. And so Jesus wants us to be ready, to be prepared for the kingdom. Now, as we look at this, the interesting thing here is He says that it's His good pleasure to give us the kingdom. And He talks about where our treasure is, there will our hearts be also. And then in verse 35, He says, let your loins be girded about, and your lamps burning. And be yourselves like unto men, looking for their Lord, when He shall return from the marriage feast, that when He cometh and knocketh, they may straightway open unto Him. Now, some have looked at that as applying, in these verses, applying to Jesus' second coming. But I look at them in light of what Jesus is saying in these particular passages about the kingdom. Jesus was telling His disciples that God was going to give them the kingdom, and they need to be ready to hit the ground running. That's what I see in these particular verses. And the reason I say that is He talks about here, He uses that phrase, let your loins be girded about, or let your loins be girded up. Sometimes we see that in the Scriptures. Now, today we just kind of goes over our heads. But for the men of those days, as well as the women, many of those were wearing these long robes, and there was sort of a sack, what I'd call sack dress, went all the way down to just above their sandals, which was the sort of undershirt, t-shirt kind of thing, went all the way down to your feet, and then they had the outer garment over that. And if you wanted to move very quick, what was going to happen? Some of you ladies who wore long dresses, what happens if you try to take off running a long dress? Get all tangled up, it gets all wrapped up in your sandals and your feet, and next thing you know, the ground is flying up to catch you. And so the men, especially when they were working, would they would pull that long t-shirt type thing up, and they would pull it to the front, and they would wrap it up into a knot and tuck it under the girdle that they wore, the belt that they wore, so that basically they went from wearing a long dress, a long shirt type thing, to now they're in short pants. And so now their legs are free to work, to run, whatever it is to do. And this is a very good depiction of the fact that when Jesus ascended back to the Father, He was with the disciples for some 40 days after the resurrection, and He opened their understanding that they might understand the Scriptures. He gave them commandments. He taught them about the church and what was about to take place. And so there was like this 10-day window between the time that Jesus ascended to heaven and He sent the Holy Spirit back. And so in those 10 days, it was nothing but wait. Jesus told them to stay in Jerusalem until they received the gift of the Holy Spirit. Now, it doesn't really say, at least in the Scriptures, that He told them it's only going to be 10 days. The way that Luke records the charge that was given to them was just stay here in Jerusalem and wait until the promise of the Father comes, which was the Holy Spirit. And so in that sense, in those 10 days, it was kind of a time of preparation. It was a time when they had to get everything squared away. They had to get, again, their garments girded up. They had to have their lamps lit, ready to go. Be prepared. That's the image that we have here. Don't get caught off guard. And in those 10 days, one of the things that Luke tells us in the book of Acts, the first chapter, what's one of the things they did in between those 10 days? The time Jesus left and then the time that the Holy Spirit came. What were they doing? Or what's one of the things that they did? They replaced Judas. They made sure that they had the 12 apostles. They understood the fulfillment of the prophecy that someone must take his place. And so in preparation, it was a 12-man job. Now we can again discuss why 12, but it was a 12-man job. That's what Jesus established it as. And so they knew that they had to have 12 people, 12 apostles. And of course they had to look at the qualifications, those who were qualified, pick the best to replace and to take the office of Judas. So again, when the Holy Spirit came, when the church was established, when God finally gave to them in His good pleasure the kingdom, when it finally came, that they would be ready. And as we look in Acts, the 2nd chapter, I think we can all agree that, they had their loins girded up, they had their lamps lit, they were ready for when the Holy Spirit came. And starting on the day of Pentecost, Peter stood up with the 11, and he clearly explained the events and the fulfillment of the prophecy. And the church, it hit the ground running, and it just kept growing and going until what Paul says in the book of Colossians, that the gospel had been preached to every creature under heaven, at least in the known part of the world. In those that time frame, the gospel had went there. And so, again, we want to be prepared, we want to be ready. Now there is applications of that also made by Jesus when it comes to His second coming and His second return in judgment, that we would be prepared. It says, "But know this, that if the master of the house had known what hour the thief was coming, he would have watched and not have left his house to be broken through." And so preparation means everything. And you try to cover all your bases. And in this day and age, I think we all understand what happens about, again, watching over your belongings and making sure that you have some kind of security. You lock the doors, you do the things. I know when we leave, we turn on the security cameras and all that so we can watch our neighbors when we're gone as they tramps around through our yard. That's what happens. But, fortunately, we haven't had to deal with anything other than the deers, cats, dogs, and a few of the neighbors wandering around. But we want to, again, be ye ready, for in the hour think not the Son of Man cometh. And Peter asked a question then in verse 41, "Lord, speakest thou this parable unto us, or even unto all?" Now, he was speaking among the disciples and those who were assembled there. And when Peter hears this, he says, "Lord, are you talking to us?" And by us, he means primarily the apostles, those who he had chose. Or are you speaking in regard to everybody that is here who should be paying attention to this? And the Lord said, "Who then is a faithful and wise servant, whom his Lord shall set over his household, to give them their portion and food in due season? Blessed is that servant whom his Lord, when he cometh, find so doing." And so, as he answers that question, he is in essence saying, well, first of all, I'm talking to the servant. It's the servant that does the master's bidding. You don't expect people who are not the master's servants to be doing the bidding of the master. And so that's his first explanation. And so he talks about those who are faithful in carrying out the master's request, that those are the ones that, again, will be rewarded by being set over the house, all that he has. But verse 45 says, "But if that servant shall say in his heart, My Lord delayeth his coming, and shall begin to beat the men servants and maid servants, to eat, drink, to be drunken, the Lord of that servant shall come in a day when he expecteth not, and in that hour when he knoweth not, and shall cut him asunder and point his portion with the unfaithful." And again, I see that going right back to what we were talking about with Judas. He was telling Peter basically that it was the servants of the master who were to prepare and to do the master's bidding. And if they, again, became careless and did not watch, there was a chance that they would lose their position, or that they would lose their place, and he would set someone else over or in that place. Now, it was God's intent that the kingdom was coming. Nothing's going to stop that. And Peter makes it clear in Acts 2 concerning the crucifixion of Jesus that all of those things that took place happened through the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God. He knew everything that was going to happen, and so it was his intent to do that. It was up to the 12, and this gives us insight once again into free will. He's telling them, it's your choice. You can prepare, you can get yourself together. There's lots of things about to happen, of course. We're not to the crucifixion yet, so there are many things that are yet to happen. We talk about the 10 days specifically in Acts, but when you think about it, you still have to go through. And how his disciples handled his arrest, his trial, his crucifixion, his death. Again, what part they may have had in it, such as Judas in betraying Jesus. Everyone had free will. Everyone could do as they pleased. And when they arrested Jesus, it appears that most of them fled. And we know John and Peter kind of followed along. John, being known in the house of the high priest, was able to kind of get a little closer to the situation and see what was going on. But each of them had to decide what they were going to do. Now, Jesus forewarned Peter that he was going to deny him 3 times. Peter said, "Not so, Lord. I won't do that." But he did. But it was up to him to decide what he was going to do after he realized that he had denied the Lord. Judas, we're told, when he saw that Jesus was condemned and he saw that apparently the disciples weren't going to fight to establish the kingdom and that Jesus was going to be put to death, Judas was filled with sorrow. He went and he gave the money back to the Jewish leaders who had paid him to betray Jesus. Again, he could have. And this, goes back to free will. What's he going to do after that? he sees that the events that are going to take place. And we really don't know why specifically he hung himself, but we know that whatever he thought was going to happen apparently was not happening the way that he intended. And so rather than repenting, rather than waiting to see how the events were going to unfold, he, like many people, he was overwhelmed with guilt. And guilt is again, not always productive if we don't find a way to channel that, if we don't find a way to get forgiveness. And so there was a lot of things going on. And so we see what Judas was doing. We see Peter in his denial of Christ. We don't have a picture of all of them. We know one of them was struggling, and he was wrapped probably in his outer garment, covered in that, planning to sleep that night. A lot of times we talk about the outer garment was used for many things, and one of that was a blanket. At night, they looked like they were going to be sleeping there in Gethsemane, and so one at least had sort of got himself ready for bed. He wasn't wearing anything. He took the undergarment off, and he was sort of covered or wrapped up in the outer garment. And of course, when the struggling and all happened, the cover was pulled off. When people were clutching at his clothes, it pulled that covering that he had on off, and he fled into the night without any clothes at all. And so it's just a lot of things going on that night. And so whether or not we are prepared or ready, and whether or not ultimately we will have a portion. And so Judas' portion was given to someone else. Peter repented, and he had his place, and the others were there and ready for the day that was coming. In verse 44 says, "Of a truth I say unto you that he will set him over all that he hath." These disciples that Jesus is speaking of, primarily the 12, in answer to Peter, who took charge of the church? The apostles. They became leaders in the church there at Jerusalem, and as time went on, deacons were appointed and elders were appointed. And other congregations, no doubt, were started in the area of Judea. People went into the other cities there. Jesus said that they would be witnesses of him in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and then the uttermost parts of the earth. And so they took on the primary leadership, and we see many of them who had houses and possessions and all. They went and sold what they had and brought it and laid it at the apostles' feet, and they kind of took the oversight of that and the daily ministration of the widows and the needy and dishing out whatever it was that the people have need of. And so they were set over the church. And Paul, speaking in the book of Galatians, the first chapter, when he talks about his going back to Jerusalem, he saw there Peter and James and some of the others, and he says they seemed to be, or appeared to him to be, pillars in the church there. And that's the same kind of thing as a leadership. They had a strong role there. But his responsibility, Paul's, was a little bit different. But we're back to those kind of things about being prepared. They needed to be prepared. We need to be prepared. We ought to be considering what it is that we have to do and what God has called us to do. Any questions or comments? Any makes the point that the servant who knew his Lord's will and made not ready, nor did according to his will, shall be beaten with many stripes. And he that knew not and did things worthy of stripes shall be beaten with few. And to whomsoever much is given, to him much shall be required, and to whom they commit much, of him will they ask the more. And here we have, and we could break it into various parts, but we have the apostles, and they're going to have a big chunk of responsibility. There's eyes on them all the time. People are coming to them. Then there are the other disciples. You run into people like Luke and Mark and some of the others who weren't apostles, Barnabas. And so they're in a different category. And then there's the multitudes. And so we kind of see all of that. And, some have used this verse to say that those who have never obeyed the gospel and didn't know God would be punished less than those who knew God and didn't obey the gospel, knew the Lord's will but chose not to follow it. That may have some impact, but to me, hell is hell. That it's eternal. It's an everlasting destruction from the presence of God. So, to me, he's talking more about, how God will hold those in accountability. Over in the book of James, the 3rd chapter, James makes a statement there. Don't be many masters, don't be many teachers, because they will receive the greater judgment. Because as Jesus says, to whom more is given, more is expected as to how they do that. And so if someone is incapable of comprehending the scriptures as they should, I think we all know people who, again, they may take an interest in the church, been baptized into the church, but on another level, they just don't have the ability to comprehend and understand a lot. And so not much is expected of them. God does not expect great things out of them, but then on the other hand, someone who is capable of reading and interpreting and understanding the scriptures and then ignores them is going to have to give an answer for that also. And the reason that I say most of this is applied not to judgment, but again, the church and what's going on in the church is because of the next statement Jesus makes. Does anybody have any comments or questions down through there? In verse 49, Jesus said, I came to cast fire, and Brother McGarvey puts in parentheses here, firebrand, upon the earth. And what do I desire if it is already kindled? It's kind of interesting, but what Jesus is talking about here is the impact that the gospel is going to have on the world. And that fire has already been kindled. Him and many other religious leaders are already knocking heads. They've been doing that for some time. We've seen that in our studies. And for the people, there are those who are kind of siding with the Pharisees and the scribes and others, and there's some who are siding with Jesus and his disciples and what's going on, and they're crisscrossing paths, and the fire has already been kindled. Some people looked that Jesus was coming to make peace, and he did afford the opportunity for us to make peace with God. But in this particular passage, Jesus says, I didn't come really to make peace, but he came to set things afire. A lot of times when forests have all kinds of brush and stuff in it, when a forest fire starts, a lot of times they let the forest fire burn to get rid of all the undergrowth and all of those things, because though we may not fully understand it, we're told the forests end up doing better by clearing out some of the clutter and underbrush and things which are robbing the bigger trees of the opportunity to grow. And Jesus talks about the fact that, he came to earth to cast fire on the earth, set things on fire. And so he says, I have, verse 50, I have a baptism to be baptized with, and how am I straitened, distressed, perplexed, until it be accomplished? And of course, the baptism that he's talking of is his betrayal, his crucifixion. And so he asks a question in 51, think ye that I am come to give peace in the earth? How do you think most people would answer that? Most people would think that, well, Christianity is a religion in essence of love, so surely Jesus' coming was supposed to be some kind of peaceful transition, some kind of they look for that kingdom as a place where the distress, the arguments, divisions, fightings, all that's over. But Jesus asked them a question: do you suppose I came to bring peace to the earth? And he says, I tell you, no, but rather divisions. Now this almost seems contradictory to everything that we see in the Scriptures. Paul tells us that there shouldn't be any divisions among us, that we ought to be joined together in the same mind and in the same judgment. He also talks about in 2 Corinthians 5 how that we as ambassadors for Christ want the world to be reconciled to God. And so all that's true. But sometimes, again, you have to upset the cart to really get people's attention. And so it's not like there wasn't already division. The Sadducees were divided against the Pharisees, and the Herodians were at odds with others, and these different groups were already there. And all of them had their own little private agendas going on. But Jesus is coming to bring all that, so to speak, to a head by setting it on fire. And he says in this, for there shall be from henceforth 5 in one house divided, 3 against 2, 2 against 3. They shall be divided, father against son, son against father, mother against daughter, and daughter against her mother, mother-in-law against her daughter-in-law, daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and we might just put etc. But, in all of this, Jesus, in coming here, he's going to make a point. You're either with me, we're going back to that verse that we've looked at before, that he that is not with me is against me, and he that gathereth not with me scattereth abroad. It was easy in that day for them to just kind of say, well, he's a Pharisee, he's a Sadducee, she's married to this, she's married to that, he's the son of this, she's a daughter of that. Again, different political views. But now it's not just that little local politics and political stuff. We're into the big things: saved or lost, Christian, non-Christian, faithful, unfaithful. Part of the church that Jesus died for were not a part of the church that Jesus died for. And part of that division, again, I've thought about what he says here, and I think about, we get all excited on the day of Pentecost. There were 3,000 people that were baptized that day, and that's an amazing thing. That's an exciting thing. But have you ever thought what happened that night? Have you ever thought what happened when the woman who was baptized goes home to the Pharisee who wasn't baptized? I've always, after I've studied a bit, I've always wondered, we're told by Paul that he was the son of a Pharisee. He was a Hebrew of Hebrews. His father was a Roman citizen. He was a Roman citizen. And I've always wondered how Paul's father reacted to Saul of Tarsus being transformed into the Apostle Paul. I mean, perhaps his dad embraced Christianity, I don't know. But his dad, just like Paul, had a long heritage to uphold and defend. And so the scriptures are kind of silent as to how Paul's mother and father responded to him. But I always wonder, the sons, the daughters, the husbands, wives, out of those, there was many more than 3,000, and they weren't there on that day to be added to the church that Jesus was building. That wasn't the reason they came to Jerusalem. It's not the reason they came to the temple. What did they come to the temple for? What was going on? It was in the middle of Passover. They were in Passover, and now they've moved on into Pentecost, and they were there to observe that. And so, they were continuing on with the things. Jesus died at the Passover, and then the church was established on Pentecost. And so, we didn't come to Jerusalem to become a part of this other group. We were just going to come down to Jerusalem. We were going to fulfill the requirements, and then we were going to turn around and go back home. But many of those stayed. I wonder how many went home, again, divided. And so this is what Jesus said. And we see that in the early days of the church, there was much division still among the religious leaders. Probably families, just as Jesus says. And, we see in Hebrews, the 10th chapter there, many people seem to be receiving pressure from their families to go back. Some of these Hebrew Christians were, it seemed, being pressured by their families to go back to the synagogue on Saturday. Well, you come with us to the synagogue on Saturday, and you can go with your friends on Sunday, or, you need to give up, that stuff on Sunday. You need to get back in the synagogue and be faithful. And so when it talks about those who are forsaking the assembling of themselves together, a lot of that, when it talks about so much the more encouraging one another as we see the day approaching. I can't imagine what it was like in a Hebrew family, that one was still an Orthodox, as we think of it, Jew, and their son was a Christian. And Friday night comes, and it's always been a Sabbath tradition to always get together and go to the synagogue and do all those kind of things. And now, it's kind of different. And the pressure and all that was going on there. So, and again, if you've noticed, those Jewish mothers seem to have a real strong opinion of things. And so we can imagine what it was like for the mother-in-law and daughter-in-law and all the things that were going on. And even today, we still have those kind of events. Anything on that? Jesus goes on and said, beginning in verse 54, when you see a cloud rising in the west, straightway you say, there cometh a shower, and so it cometh to pass. And when you see a south wind blowing, you say, there will be a scorching heat, and it come to pass. You hypocrites, you know how to interpret the face of the earth and the heaven, but how is it that you know not how to interpret this time? And of course, that's the time of the Messiah and the prophecies that were made by Daniel and others. And they should have been able to, starting with the baptism of John and the things that were going on, to have made a more logical interpretation. But it seems that they were more afraid of losing their place, their position, their status. And so Jesus charges them that they're hypocrites. You know, you can discern the sky, and you can discern the way the wind's blowing, and it comes to pass, and you know that, but you can't discern the fact that the kingdom of heaven is coming among you, that the time is here. So, for as thou art going with that adversary before the magistrate on the way, give diligence to be quiet of him, lest haply he drag thee before the judge shall deliver to the officer, and the officer shall cast thee in prison. I say unto thee, thou shalt not by no means come out thence till thou hast paid the very last mite. And so this likewise is kind of a statement that goes along the way he's using it here to these people. You know, you ought to know certain things. And one of those things is that if you're guilty and you're going to court, if you know that you're guilty, if you know that you owe somebody money, Jesus said, wouldn't it be a smart thing to, again, pay your debt, make some kind of arrangement before you get into court? Because if you know you owe the money, and he knows you owe the money, and he has witnesses to prove, or papers or documents to prove that you owe him the money, what's the end result going to be? You know, you're going to be found guilty, and you're going to have to pay the debt. And if you don't have money to pay the debt, now you're going to be cast into what we call debtor's prison. And you're not coming out until you've paid the last mite, that widow's mite, that last, or we'd say the last penny. So it would be better to make out some kind of agreement and start paying that debt and stay free. And so there are things that we just know in life. And Jesus says it's very difficult for him to believe that they don't see and understand what's going on. And so he again calls them hypocrites because the signs were there, the fulfillment was there, all of those things that were taking place, the miracles that Jesus was doing. And so ultimately, you know, they're not going to be able, they can resist Jesus, they can resist the church, they can resist all of those things. But that's not going to change anything, because we go right back to the fact that it is the Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. The kingdom is coming. You can crucify Jesus, you can do all those things, but that's not going to stop the church, the kingdom, from coming.
Why not make this the day that you and your family seek out the Church of Christ in your community? We encourage you to attend one of our worship times or Bible studies. God's grace, truth, and salvation is truly worth finding and knowing. May God bless and keep you as we walk together in His truth. And remember, as always, the Churches of Christ salute you. Our new programs are posted to Facebook and YouTube on Thursday afternoon, and they should be available for viewing by 7 p.m. We also encourage our viewers to visit our website at www.thechurchesofchrist.life. We ask that you like us on Facebook and share our programs. On YouTube, please share and subscribe for notifications. This program was pre-recorded.